Hello and welcome to Wigtown Book Festival. I'm Simon James Green. I am the author of young adult novels Noah Can't Even, Alex in Wonderland, Heartbreak Boys, and You're the One That I Want. And I'm really excited this evening to be chatting with none other than Phil Stamper. Phil is the author of YA novels The Gravity of Us, As Far As You'll Take Me, and coming up next year as well, Golden Boys. Now, Phil grew up in Ohio, has a BA in music and an MA in publishing and creative writing. Both of those things we're going to chat about a little bit later. But he now lives, I think, in Brooklyn and is joining us live from New York City, I think. Hi, Phil.
Hi, so nice to talk with you. I'm actually just outside of New York City because we recently bought a house. So my bio is now totally outdated.
Out of date.
I live in the suburbs now. I've completely sold out. No longer a Brooklyn native, but I'm okay with that. My main character Cal would be very disappointed since he loves Brooklyn so much. But you know, sometimes you need more than a one bedroom, especially during a pandemic.
You certainly do, and there's no shame in moving out to the suburbs. That's what I've done as well. So you know that's totally fine. Now, just before we get cracking, I should say to anyone watching, there will be a Q&A at the end of this little chat we're going to have. So if you've got any questions, if you're watching live on YouTube, you can whack them in the live chat box. Or if you're watching on the Wigtown website, there should be an Ask a Question box just below the live feed. So pop them in there. They'll be sent on to me and Phil, and we'll try and answer some of your questions towards the end of this session. But Phil, well, let's talk first of all about your debut novel, can we? The Gravity of Us, because you briefly mentioned Cal there and the fact he lives in Brooklyn. Now, this is a really interesting novel, isn't it? Because when you kind of hear the premise, it's immediately to me it sort of sounds quite sort of high concept almost in lots of ways because of the subject matter. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the deal is with this book in terms of what it's about?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just say that The Gravity of Us is actually the fourth book I had written. Of course, first to be published, first to give me a book deal, but it was the first to get a book deal, I think, because it's so hard to break out in YA contemporary, especially queer YA, especially at this time where there are so many stories on the shelves, and like that is absolutely wonderful. But you also have to say, like, what is this book saying? How is this going to stand out? Because as you know, as much as we hate to say it, it's, well, I mean, and it's not even me saying this, it's the publishing industry focuses on marketing and sales, and they want to know, like, can we sell this book? And so when I came up for the idea for The Gravity of Us, I was not thinking about like marketability or anything like this. I had just had 3 rejected books that, you know, I've had hundreds of rejections. I'm really frustrated. And I just start kind of listing things that I really think are cool. And I'm like, what do I want to write about? I'm feeling like down. And so when I think of things that like make me happy and like make me interested and intrigued, the 60 space race came up because you can't really see, but on my bookshelf, I have like an entire section dedicated to space race related books. And so I did so much, you know, that all went into the research of this book, but really it was just kind of, I was doing it for fun. You know, I watched Apollo 13 like, I don't know, 12 years ago, and I was like just so obsessed with it that I made it my entire like identity in college. And so really throughout all of that, I was just like, okay, I really love, I love everything about like the space race and like because I'm such a kind of communications person, like the various levels of the communications that were at play during the space race between like magazines and news media and kind of pop culture stuff, it just was like the perfect storm. And I was like, well, why don't I just bring that into the present? Because we have those kind of dynamics right now. And I can set a queer love story kind of throughout the book, not the entire point of the book, but not a small part. And then I can, you know, weave in my nerdy earth sciences bit when we get to like interview a geologist, or, you know, like I was like, anything nerdy I'm just gonna pack in here because I'm gonna have a great time writing this. Who knows if anyone will ever read it. And I think that's really what made it stand out, because it was just so like uniquely me.
Right.
And that's kind of what, and then the cover also,
Of course.
that,
So
that was
was there a high level of kind of extra research you had to do with this? Because just in case anyone's not read it, this is basically regarding a kind of the first manned mission to Mars, isn't it? Basically, that's what's going on in this book in terms of the kind of the modern day version of the space race, really. So, like, I mean, you obviously are clearly a self-confessed space nerd, Phil. So you obviously have a certain level of background knowledge. But reading it, I was struck by there's quite a lot of detail in there about NASA and how they work and the various sort of research elements that go on behind the scenes. Was that something you had to delve into in a kind of extra way, if you like?
Yeah, and so the last 12 years have been me researching this book, but not realizing that that's what it was leading toward. So there's so much just like knowledge that I had just in the back of my mind of like, nerdy space facts, or like how this mission worked, or like the Apollo and Gemini missions, like how they were recruiting new astronauts and what drama that brought to the whole scene in Houston. And so I knew all of these things. Obviously, I had to go back and check, and I also needed to do more research on kind of what NASA is doing now. And what's funny is I was like, well, at the end of the day, like, this is fiction. So NASA's going to do whatever I say it's going to do. But so much of that, the decisions I made were like, you know what, I do think that they would try to go to the moon again, to the Mars. They're going to be making these steps, literally, these steps in the future. And I think that when they do it, they're going to make it a publicized crap show. We'll just say that, because that's what it has to be. That's what it was back in the 60s. We didn't have social media or, Entertainment Weekly, or, we didn't have these kind of different venues, but we had enough. Like they were already kind of, these families were put on these bizarre pedestals as like the Hollywood of the South. Right. And so I knew that this was going to be what they ended up doing. And it was so funny because after I announced the book, like, I want to say like 6 months after, they announced the Artemis programs that's supposed to take, the first woman to the moon, the next round of astronauts to the moon, basically. And they've already started announcing kind of their plans for Mars. And then they're now starting to do like public flights, like partnering with SpaceX for like public flights. And it's like kind of inching toward this like publicity stunt level. And I know it's always such a balance, but it was just so funny for me to watch this happen, to be like, I knew you would do it. Like, you did it in the 60s, you're going to do it now. And it's going to work to some extent. Like, you have to get that attention from the public, or you don't have any funds in your bank account to go to the moon. So
that's interesting, because I had no idea that was how it was operating. I kind of imagined it in the 60s to be very kind of, scientific and popularly funded. It never occurred to me that actually there was a lot of that stuff going on, and having public opinion on side was so crucial for such big budget kind of things, and explorations, which is really interesting. Because in this book, it's quite interesting because you kind of deal. So what's happening is that you've got this kind of reality TV show running alongside the Mars mission, right? Who are kind of interviewing the various astronauts and their families. They're called Star Watch, aren't they? That's their kind of thing. I mean, and they are, they're everything you would expect reality TV to be. They're awful. They manufacture drama for ratings and all that kind of stuff. But running alongside that, you've then got Cal, who's really active on social media, isn't he? And is a big kind of almost social media star, really. He's got a big following. So what was your thinking in terms of how you wanted to play that? Because my sense from the book is that the social media aspect was portrayed in quite a positive light, really, right, compared to reality TV. Is that how you sort of see things going and how things are?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard because I didn't go into this book wanting to be like reality TV bad, social media good, this is bad, because like everything about my books are kind of nuanced, and it's kind of like there aren't many people in my books who are like genuinely the bad guys. There's one in The Gravity of Us, which I will give you, as the bad guy with not many redeeming qualities. Didn't really want to give him a redeeming storyline, but I would say for the most part, it is very kind of nuance between what are the benefits of social media, how taxing is that on Cal, like what stress does he put himself under? But I do think like when I was writing this book, I was really inspired by, I wrote this book back in 2016, just after the election in the U.S. That was not wonderful for queer people, but I was really inspired by so many queer people queer teens who took to social media to really like to explain why they were hurting and like why things needed to change. And I just saw so many good things happening on social media. Of course, it's an awful place in other ways. Like there's going to be so much bad in social media. Like we've seen it all, especially over the last few years.
Right.
But I really wanted to celebrate the good of it. And so Cal, this is from Cal's perspective. So from the perspective of this book, social media can do no wrong. Cal's voice is the one, like he's very focused on like, this is my voice, I'm going to use it, this is the right way to do everything. And like it gets him in trouble sometimes, but it is very pure. And that's the kind of energy that I wanted to bring to this, because everything else, like NASA had their own agendas, they had their own manipulation in their kind of press area. And then also with the reality show, Shooting Stars, they have their own agendas, they have their own goals. But for Cal, he has his own agenda, but his agenda is more to like get the truth out about this program. And I thought that was kind of like a little bit of an honorable thing for a teen to take on, and something that made sense, that like a teen would be his voice would be the one that kind of reaches a little bit farther than anyone was expecting.
Yeah, definitely. I love the way he sort of basically took control of this narrative from this huge kind of reality TV firm, and actually was the one that kind of wanted to put the truth out there, and actually sort of focused on some of the science stuff, the stuff that kind of really matters, rather than everything else they were trying to get out of it. You mentioned queer teens just a moment ago in relation to social media, but let's talk a little bit about the queer love story that kind of runs through The Gravity of Us, which is really nice. There's a real sense of kind of positivity in this book, and I think you mentioned in your author's note for your later book that the world of Gravity of Us is quite aspirational, in the sense that the characters don't really face any huge kind of barriers in terms of homophobia and that kind of stuff. It's not blatant. Was that a very deliberate choice on your part? Did you set out to write a book that would have that very kind of positive, joyful message in it, or was it something that just sort of developed as you were writing it?
So it's hard to know exactly what my intentions were going into it. I think it's partially that's just how it was developing. And then it's partially, once I realized what I was doing, I was like, oh God, this is what I've been needing. And again, this was kind of a response to the election that had just happened. I wrote this for NaNoWriMo, which is now National Novel Writing Month, which happens in November, and right in the middle of this, like, trying to do an entire draft in November. The election happens. I'm feeling pretty down and a little hopeless. And the way I kind of came back from that was just kind of focusing on queer joy and hopeful stories. And in this one, I realized just like how important that was to me, versus some of the other queer books, including my own queer books on the shelves, that really do feature homophobia as a plot point, or because it is finding your identity is such a big part of your teen years. So it totally makes sense that so many books out there are going to focus on this and say, okay, you're finding out who you are. Part of who you are is being queer. So like, how is that affecting you? Like that, it totally makes sense. I get that line of reasoning. But then when I was writing this, I was like, it's so cool to like not have to do that. Like I didn't have to wait. Like people talk about how like it's a love at first sight kind of romance. It's very fast. That's because there's really not much in their way. Even despite this whole world, like they don't have their own mental hangups going into this, and that's something that that was just so cool for me, because like I don't see that often. I don't write that often. And I was just having a really fun time giving them that like aspirational love story, because you need both, honestly.
You 100% need both, but it's really refreshing to see something that happens easily and joyfully and with no barriers. It's a real thing. I don't know about you, but when I was at school, there simply were no books with LGBT themes anyway. And certainly if there were gay characters mentioned, it would invariably be in a tragic setting or outcome. Was it like that for you when you were at high school? And I mean, is there a sense in which, you know, when you're writing books like this, that, you know, you kind of wanted to perhaps, you know, write a book which you would have loved to have read as a teen yourself?
Right. I mean, as a teen, books, movies, all sorts of media, like even news stories, like there were no positive queer stories that I got to see. And that's because I was kind of living my own sheltered rural Ohio life, and like didn't have access to what a lot of other teens might have, who might have been able to find this kind of content. But there just wasn't much out there. And I remember, you know, because so the only queer piece of media I'd seen were like Brokeback Mountain, which like doesn't have a happy ending, and then Rent, which like has plenty of traumas within it to the queer characters. And so it's like all these things are just like, okay, well, like these are like touching stories, but I just like don't have much hope. And this was a time I did not have much hope growing up. And then I finally, when I was like 19, I think I watched this movie called Shelter. And it was just, it's a queer rom-com movie. And I don't even know how I discovered it, but I remember watching it, and I just at the end of the movie, I was like, wait, they end up together? Like they're happy? It was like a happy ending montage of them like on the beach holding hands.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I don't understand. And then I really had to interrogate, like, whoa, okay, that's dangerous. Like, this is your first thought is like, that's not realistic, because there were two gays that were happy at the end of this movie. And so it's just, that's kind of what I've held on to. And that's what I, even like in the books that I write that are going to be a little bit darker, it still has to have that hope and that joy throughout the book. And that's really what I wanted to focus on, and like give teens that opportunity to have these stories before they're 19 or before they're, you know, 25 or whatever.
Exactly. It's so important, isn't it? And I think you know, books like that can do such good work out there, making people feel good about themselves and you know who they are, which is so important. Just one last thing I want to ask you about this book is that obviously, you know, the whole space, the race to Mars thing, it's all really exciting. So from a craft point of view, when you were actually writing this, was there ever a danger that whole mission to Mars thing might slightly eclipse the lovely, beautiful stories of the characters on the ground? Was that something you had to really sort of be careful of? And how did you tackle it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I don't think anyone's asked me that question. But I don't think it was an issue for me. And I think specifically for me, because when I went back and I, you know, watched these, you know, even Apollo 13, but like all of the like documentaries and read the books, I realized that what I was searching for was like the stories that were not really easily represented on there. Like, you know, everyone knows the astronauts' lives so much, but then when they hint at their families, when they talk about their families, or like when the Astronaut Wives Club book came out and got to talk about all the drama between the astronaut wives and like their, you know, I realized that these women, especially the wives, were like, they had families to take care of. They were suddenly superstars on the cover of magazines, and you know, they didn't know if their husband was going to make it home alive that night. Like that, and they'd spent their entire, you know, adulthood worrying about this. And, you know, there's so much drama on the ground that always appealed to me. And that's what I really wanted to highlight. So it's really cool to go to space. And like, even, you know, I'm sure there are plenty of people who like pick up the book because they think like we go to space in it, and like get disappointed. But I hope people still get kind of captivated by what happens on the ground, because I think even while writing it, I was just in the drama, and I loved it, because I mean, it was just so fun for me.
Well, and I agree, and I think that's the fun of it. You know, like you say, it's this sort of pressure cooker environment these characters get put into. Like where you say, they don't know if their spouse or their partner is going to come home alive at the end of the day, because it's such a high-risk environment. I mean, what a place to then also explore such fundamental human stories like falling in love, you know, as a teenager. Brilliant, you know. It's a terrific book, folks, if you haven't read it yet. So do pick it up. All of those books are available from the Wigtown bookshop, so you can pick up a copy there, I would think. But let's move on from space to the world of music. Phil, now I mentioned earlier that you have a BA in in music, don't you?
I do.
Which doesn't surprise me reading this book. Did you by any chance specialize in the oboe or anything like that?
So I can play almost any instrument. I've taken lessons on most of them, and like that's part of music school. You do get to learn, like you take a high strings class. So like I know how to play all the high strings, but like I know how to play it. It doesn't mean it really has much resonance for me. Oboe I had played in high school because I thought it was really cool and it was unique, and they got all the solos. So like I really was attracted to that kind of. I was not a flashy person. I did not like the spotlight, but then I also like found myself drawn to those kind of instruments that like really stood out in unique ways. And so that's really when I knew that I wanted Marty to be a musician. That's really where I gravitated, is like, what would be his instrument? And so like oboe was kind of the first thing that came to mind for me, because it's unique and you remember it. It's something that like I would not have felt comfortable doing had I not played the oboe or like known how, because it's a finicky instrument. It's really hard to do. It's like you can't just like have a passing knowledge of music and write a book about an oboist. And so I was a piano major. So my focus was piano. I took 4 hours of lessons a week for all of college for that.
Wow. Okay.
But I did kind of play everything else, because like in band you can't play piano. So like in marching band I was not playing piano, so I would play like saxophone or whatever. I just play different things. It's like, why not?
You see, that's good, because as a fellow writer, I sort of read your books, Gravity Bus, and this one as well, as far as You'll Take Me, and I think, oh my goodness, the level of detail and research in this, I could never be bothered to, if I didn't know it, to go there and they obviously write anything that would portray it in an accurate way. But this is a book about a guy called Marty. He lives in Kentucky, doesn't he, I think?
He does. Yes, he's from Kentucky, which is just south of Ohio. There are a lot of similarities there.
Very good. Where you grew up. But he basically books a one-way ticket to London, doesn't he? To kind of escape, I suppose, his life in Kentucky and everything he feels is sort of keeping him down there. And I guess start a kind of new life in London, basically. What made you pick London as the destination? Is that a city that you're very familiar with, that you particularly enjoy?
So yes, I chose London because I got my master's in London because I was trying to transition my career into book publishing, and so I'm currently a book publisher and an author separately. It's fun to have two careers, but I was really focusing on that second career when I went to London, and it kind of just made sense, because I was at a time in my life, I was like in my mid-20s, and I was recently married, and we were kind of looking for a new adventure. We'd been in DC for 5 years, and so we were thinking of what is our next step. I found this program. It was a quarter of the cost of any relevant US programs, even with the international fee, and with the pound being like way stronger than the dollar.
Right.
And so I was like, wait, so I can save money. We can live in London for a year. I'll be back in the workforce faster because it's only 12 months in London versus 2 full years in the US.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, I think we make this work. And so of course we moved. I was completely broke, and we did the most we could with like very little income. However, it was just such a cool, amazing, overwhelming experience that I actually started writing As Far As You'll Take Me for while I was living there, because I was like, oh, we're doing so much travel, we're doing this is such an overwhelming experience that I would remember, that this kind of became, it's all fictional, of course, but this kind of became my diary in the background, when I'm like describing places and scenes and moments and where they decide to go. That was my way to like sneak in my own kind of private diary from that year back in 2014, 2016, when I got to live in London.
So basically Marty's kind of first experiences of seeing certain things for the first time, or experiencing British culture, is kind of mirrors to some extent your own, basically, because that was your first time in London too.
Yeah, and I will say, like, even his experience with anxiety, I had like my anxiety was not managed, and I had not really figured out how to get it managed. Like, and I, you know, even through my entire time in London, I didn't know how to do that. But that was also really helpful and therapeutic for me because, you know, I was just not at a place where I was ready to like seek treatment when I was living in London. But it's so overwhelming to do an international move, and it like constantly triggers your anxiety that you just kind of, it kind of takes over. And I wanted to show that with this character in a very hopeful story, but like really focus on what's happening inside Marty's head. And so that's why there's so much like this is like versus Cal, who's just speaking all the time. He's very external. Marty's very internal, and like, and it was so fun to like have that dynamic between my first two books of like, okay, now we're going inside someone's head for a little while. They're gonna be a little quieter, and that's really that's part of the inspiration for kind of his journey.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about him because, yeah, in contrast to the gravity of us, I mean, for example, with the sort of the homophobia issue, Marty deals with an awful lot more, doesn't he, in this book? And it starts right back in Kentucky, doesn't it, really, for him?
Yeah, I mean, so Marty is raised in a really religious, conservative household, and that's a pain point for him, obviously, as we find out very early on, and that's why he feels like he has to leave, he has to escape, and he refers to it as an escape, at certain points in the book, and I feel like that was something that I could really relate to just as a teen, because I went to college. I went to college 20 minutes from my parents' house, so like really not that far away, but it was not a farming village in Ohio, so like that was a step up. Anything was a step up from that. So like I still had that kind of feeling of like, wow, like I'm in it, I'm on my own, even though I'm like literally on a campus in campus housing. But it was such a different experience. But like I'm very melodramatic, so like clearly this is where so much of Marty's like doe-eyed kind of adventure started from. And so like I was able to kind of put a little bit of how my religious upbringing made me feel into this book as well, because there's I know that like there are so many books out there that do cover this and do include homophobia, like as we were just saying, but I really did want to show my story through Marty's eyes, because I feel like it was a little different. It doesn't, I mean, no two stories are the same, but like it was just so, I feel like we just don't have enough conversations about like the long-term damaging effects of like some certain specific religious groups and how they kind of, I mean, because like there's so many wonderfully like accepting churches out there, and when I moved to DC, I saw plenty of them, and I was like, wow, okay, I didn't know that was even a thing. But when I was growing up, that was just not what I was surrounded by, what I was a part of. So it was kind of challenging to sort that out over my childhood, and so that's kind of why I brought it into this book, because it seemed like the perfect mix of why does Marty need to go to London? Well, that's because let's look at his background.
So this is interesting, because this religious aspect really interested me in the book, actually, because I think Marty's parents, I think he describes as sort of belonging to a kind of a mega church or something like that, which immediately I think most of us in the UK know exactly what that sort of thing is, because we've seen that sort of thing on TV quite a lot, and we can imagine it. And I know at one point I think his mum later on in the novel talks about how he two of the other women in the church come up to her and start talking about conversion therapy and stuff like that as being an option for Marty, and that's a real turning point in the novel. That wouldn't give any spoilers, but at the same time there's nuance, isn't there? Because then there's a scene a bit later in the book where Marty goes on a trip to Italy, and he visits a different type of church, right? And I think he talks with a friend there about the idea of maybe he believes in God, maybe he doesn't, but being in this place, he feels like he can believe in something, I think is said, for example. So it's clearly a really complicated issue for Marty, I guess. And is that something you feel as well, having grown up in a sort of religious sort of environment?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was, I found that like the religious aspects is like, as hard as they were to put down on the page, because I was so close to it, it was so, I guess, therapeutic, interesting. Like I was really invested in those moments, even though they're not always the like they're the quieter scenes. I'll just say that. There are a few that like really stand out to me, like that moment in the church, like you said, where he, you know, feels like he believes in something, and it's like he can believe in something, and it's like kind of him repairing his own relationship with religion and not knowing where that'll be, which like so much of this book is just like questioning, and like that is what being 17 is. Like he's not questioning his sexuality, but basically everything else in his life he's questioning. And like that's what being 17 is, and especially like religion, when it's like, okay, well, I was raised this way, they treated me poorly, I still feel something. And so I mean, one of the last scenes I wrote in one of my edits was actually probably my favorite scene of the book, but it's early on where Marty is in a practice room playing his oboe for the first time, kind of for the audience, and you see that basically music has become his religion. It has replaced his religion. It's he has his own rituals that he goes through to set up his oboe, because it's a finicky instrument and it deserves it needs those rituals to sound well. But also he's just kind of made everything feel more sacred when he does it, and that's something that was super important to me because I love music so much. But I really loved I love the group aspect of playing in ensembles and things like that. And that was something that I was so happy to put into this book just because it's fun. But also it kind of does replace that that kind of hole that religion leaves, where you want a community-based something that you can believe in. And for Marty, that ends up being music. And he'll figure out the rest of it later. But that's kind of where we got there. And so that was, I mean, so much fun for me to write. And it's one of those things, kind of like the Gravity Bus, where it's like, I'm writing it and I'm like, well, this is interesting to me. So,
but no, I think it works really well, Phil, because that whole music ensemble thing gives that sense, like you said, of community and of kind of found family, which clearly Marty was lacking when he left Kentucky and was really looking for, wasn't. So that was I think that's the really nice thing about you wrapping all this up in a kind of musical environment, is that there's some lovely scenes where the kids kind of meet up and all play together in the park, and it's really joyful, and that sense of togetherness and them all getting on together and helping each other and being there for one another is a really lovely thing to see, especially when he's come from a place where he hasn't had that support before. I thought it was a really, really nice thing. Let's talk a little bit about the romance element in this book, because unlike Gravity of Us, it's a little more complicated, isn't it? It's for Marty. It's a few more ups and downs.
I will say that Marty steps off the plane and falls in love with the literal first person he meets. And does that work well for anyone? Not really, but is it relatable? Yes. Exactly. I was like, it's just like, it's so obvious that he would too. And like, especially like when you're a repressed queer person, you've been repressed for however many years of your life, you couldn't be yourself, you didn't feel comfortable being yourself, or you're being told that like that's not who you really are, and then you have this like watershed moment where you're in a new place and you're like, I can be whoever I want to be, and that includes like having queer experiences and like actually like making connections in ways I couldn't before, and like maybe falling in love, maybe someone could fall in love with me back, like that's a possibility. And then you kind of just like, okay, well now it needs to happen now, because it's like now it's like, oh shoot, this whole time I've been like, you just kind of protect yourself, you're like, that can't happen, put it in a box away, like no, push it down. And then once it's actually like a possibility, you're like, I love you. And it's like, oh no,
it's just waiting to happen. But I also think as well, like, don't you think that I think a large part of kind of being that age and being a teenager is that things can happen much more quickly than they do when you become perhaps a little bit more older and jaded and cynical and cautious about having your heart broken, when it's not happened to you before and it's kind of all new and fresh. When I think back to myself at that kind of age, I think it was very easy to quickly think that you're falling in love with someone. So I totally get where he's coming from by stepping off the plane and it being that kind of bang sort of moment. It reads to me as being something that's actually very, very kind of real, sweet, naive, yes, but very real. But then it's not throughout the course of the novel. I mean, unlike in the Gravity of Us, and also little blips in Gravity of Us for our two main characters in the sort of romance element. But I mean, it's different from Marty, isn't it? And I don't want to give away the ending or anything, but you know, it might not be entirely the type of ending that people might automatically think of, I suppose, in lots of ways for this sort of type of book.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and I've been very clear with like my communication that this is not a romance. This is just like a coming of age story.
Yeah.
And you know, people are gonna, you know, my first one was a romance. It was like that was a big part of the book. This one, I think for it to be a romance, it has to end with happily ever after.
Right.
Characters are happy in this one. It's a hopeful book. It's like
Yeah.
it's not a bury the gays kind of book. However, the main relationship is supposed to be a barrier that Marty has to cross to become the person he needs to be. It's not about them getting together. And so I try to present like even like let's compare the covers. Like this one, when this cover was presented to me, we had a long conversation about like, should they actually be holding hands? And I said that yes, like because they could just be like close, you know, they very close where you can like do it. But I'm like, this isn't a will they won't they, like they will, they do, it's in the book copy, like, you know, it's gonna happen. Just like let them hold hands. That's the whole point of the book. That's what you want. In this one, I mean, he's a little bit more isolated and he's trying to figure out who he is. That's the whole point of the book. And so I was really glad that Pierce was not kind of pictured on this book. Because it's not his story.
It's not his story.
He like is very important to Marty, and like he has his own kind of ups and downs and has his own nuanced moments of like, and also revising it, I had plenty of moments where like one draft he was like a total nightmare, one draft he was way too nice, like, and I was just like, how do I like write this kind of nuanced relationship in a way that like is relatable but is not predictable, but you know, it's such a challenge to do that. But I am glad that like at least like visually you're kind of getting the hint at the very beginning, and also throughout the book you're like, okay, there's a lot of red flags here, and we see what you like. Even if Marty doesn't do everything that you think he should do, you do know where it is going at the end of the day.
Yeah,
hopefully.
It's a lovely, beautiful coming of age novel, actually, and a really nice, you know, journey of one young man working out who he is and finding family and friends along the way. So it's a great book, highly recommended, folks. And again, I believe available from the Wigtown Festival Bookshop if you want to grab yourself a copy, which I think you should. Now, before we move on to our final book to talk about, just a reminder, if you want to pop any questions into the live chat, please do so now. We'll have 5 or 10 minutes at the end if you've got anything you want to ask. So do pop that into the chat function and it'll be sent to us. Let's talk about your upcoming novel, Golden Boys, which is coming out, I think, in the UK. That comes out in, am I right in saying February, I think, next year? I think
it's February 8th. Oh, well, right. Sorry. So I guess it would be the 10th because it's Thursdays in the UK. So I think it would be the 10th, but actually I don't know for sure. Right. I haven't announced anything. And also, just so everyone knows, this is the US cover. There's going to be a totally different cover for the UK. It is looking beautiful. It's actually by the same, so these two are actually by the same illustrator. And so we brought him back for the third book. So actually, if you were in the UK or kind of any of the European distribution channels there, we're gonna have a different book, basically.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about Golden Boys and what it's about?
Yeah, so Golden Boys is, I always like to think of it as kind of like a queer sisterhood of the traveling pants. And like, I mean, you know, nothing but love for that book. But there's nothing magical for this one. So like there aren't magical pants for this. However, it is about 4 friends who, this is the summer before their senior year, and they're all going to be spending this in a different location. So they're 4 best friends. They're kind of bonded kind of by their being the only queer people in their small town. And they are super close. However, this summer they're all apart, and they're like, okay, well, how are we going to maintain our close friendship through these 3 months? And it ends up being quite a bit of a challenge because everyone's kind of either pursuing their dreams or dealing with family issues that are taking a lot of attention and time, and they're all separate, and they feel that their kind of bonds are breaking a little bit. And then the question comes, okay, if we can't make it through these 3 months, how are we going to make it through college? How are we going to make it through the rest of our lives still being friends? And so that is essentially what the book's about. We have one character in Boston, one character in DC, one character in Paris, I almost said London, Paris, and then one character in Daytona Beach, Florida. And they are all doing very different things, but they're still trying to stay best friends.
It really, I finished reading it this morning, and it really took me back to those kind of final couple of years of sort of secondary school, high school, where you know, you're kind of looking forward to the future, but you're also simultaneously kind of scared of it, and you're kind of clinging on to your old friendships, but everyone's sort of changing and people want different things all of a sudden. I think you capture it so well in this book, that whole feeling of kind of upheaval and kind of sadness for the past, but excitement for the future. It's really great. Was it difficult? I mean, I'm imagining it probably was a bit of a challenge writing from 4 different points of view for this book.
Yeah, so when I came up with the idea for this book, I wanted it to be multiple books, and this is a duology, so I got that. Okay. I also was like, okay, I'm going to be putting so much work into these characters. It has to be 4 perspectives. So 4 perspectives, 2 books, giving them enough time to like have a full overarching story between the duology. And then, you know, I sold it. It was wonderful. And then I was like, crap, I have to write it. Because everything else, like, you know, I have these interstitial chapters and stuff in the other books that are like the Star Watch pieces of The Gravity of Us. And then in As Far As You'll Take Me, I have diary entries. But it's just one person. Like there's one perspective for both of those books. And then ballooning up to 4 in this 3rd book, I was like, okay, maybe I bit off a little more than I could chew. Because also this was during an entire global pandemic, early days of it, whereas like, I don't even know how to wake up in the morning, but like, okay, sure, I'll write the most challenging book that I have to date. But you know, what I really wanted to focus on giving each of the 4 characters a separate identity, you know, different kind of wants, needs, motivations, really thinking about who they are. And I spent a lot of time worrying about what makes Sal, like what makes Heath. Yeah. And then I really wanted, you know, we start the book, they're all together, and I wanted them to have that bonding together on the page. And I also wanted the reader to be able to sort out who is who kind of in that early on, because of course it can be confusing having 4 perspectives, no matter how dynamic they are and different. And then when they split apart, it does get very clear who is who, because you're in literal different spots of the world. So it got a little bit easier once they were apart. And then I could really focus on like, okay, this is their time to kind of become themselves, the biggest version of themselves, before they come back theoretically for book 2. Okay. And so it took a lot of planning. That was the only thing. It took a lot of planning and like forethought. And I wanted to make sure that everyone had an even kind of say in it. But I mean, just a whole lot of like Excel sheets and a lot of just like those like where you zone out in the shower thinking about like the characters and you're like, okay, what's their motivation for this? Like, why do they act like, you know, just like that for weeks on end.
And one thing that's similar in this book, I mean, all these teams live in Ohio, don't they, I think, and they all go there on their, you know, different parts of the world. But once again, we have this idea of characters kind of leaving their hometown and going someplace different for kind of new adventures. What is it about this idea of sort of journey and moving on and moving away from the familiar, I suppose, that is so appealing to you as an author?
Oh, it just feels so YA. And it's like that kind of experience defined my teen years, like leaving, like getting out of town, and like having to grapple with the fact that you know, your comforts, everything you had like grown accustomed to for the first however many years of your life are no more. And it gives an opportunity for so much conflict. So much growth as well, like for characters, because you grow a lot more when you are kind of when you're given new experiences. And so it's so funny that like literally all of my books so far have had that. And I had obviously been thinking of this because my 2022 middle grade book, Small Town Pride, which actually comes out later next year, that is actually the first time where they're staying put. They're also 12, so they can't like run away. However, they're staying put, and it's a celebration of like my community might not totally support me or support queer people, but like, how do I make this a safer place for me and for my community? How do I like build that community? How do I figure out what pride even means to me? And so I was able to like kind of make that the antithesis of these three books, because I had spent so much time of this like adventure, you have to go away to like be okay. And I was like, no, let me actually take them back. And actually for book 2 of Golden Boys, it's going to be the same thing. They're going to be thriving kind of in Ohio for the, for the majority of the book. So it's actually going to be kind of fun to have those 2 books come out in a row, where it's like a celebration of like, things are okay here too. You don't have to leave to be happy. But it's funny that that's kind of where I went, because that's my experience as a teen. Right. So of course I'm going to reflect on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just before we come to our first question, I just wanted to ask you, quite a lot of the characters, almost all your characters actually in your books, are all quite high achievers, aren't they? So like in Golden Boys, we've got this character. Who have we got? We've got Sal, for example, who's working in Washington DC at the Capitol, right? And you've got Gabe, who's working for a kind of charity organization, and then we've got Marty, the excellent musician. We've got Cal, the social media superstar. What attracts you to writing about these kids who are kind of really quite intensely ambitious quite often and put themselves under a lot of pressure and stress? Is that what you were when you were that age? Maybe you are still. Where's it coming from?
I think that's absolutely who I was kind of when I was that age. Not that I was like, I wasn't the best musician, and I wasn't I didn't have the best grades. I didn't have the best anything. Like I would not have like, it's more than just like my mom telling me I'm special. But it is actually the case is like, I'm very ambitious, and I always want to have like future goals, and I want to work toward them. Like, and so that's, as an author, it's kind of the perfect storm of like, there are a lot of reasons to say no and to stop doing it, but I'm going to trudge forward because I have a vision at the end. And like, you kind of make headway and you kind of get there. And it's just, obviously that's just kind of a part of who I am. But also I think it's aspirational and fun for teens and for adults alike to read about kind of overachieving teens, like the ones that are just like so passionate. Like I guess I get so much of like the heart of my stories is the character's passion for whatever they're doing. And even for Marty, he had a ton of passion for music, but he was still a little lost on like how to achieve his goals, what his goals even were. So like he was super high achieving, but he didn't know what to achieve. So like I was able to at least like have a little bit of variance through these books, but the ambition is kind of always going to be a thing, like because they need to stand out on the page for me, and that's just always how I do it. It's whatever they want to be the best. I watched a lot of Pokemon growing up, and they want to be the very best, like no one ever was. That's just that's it. Those are the rules.
Listen, you don't need to explain it to me, Phil. I'm there with you every step of the way. I was exactly the same. It was a nightmare quite often, to be honest, how when you want something that badly and you're that kind of driven to get it, it's not always easy. But goodness, let's come to a question. We've got a question here from Aggie. Are the characters in the book based on you and your own experiences?
Oh, which book do you think this was about?
It doesn't say which book, but I suppose we can talk about any of the books, really, I suppose. If any of the books are the characters based on you and your own experiences.
Okay, so I guess I'll go with As Far As You'll Take Me first, because that is very similar, because I think in that conversation I was saying how similar my experiences were to Marty's. And I would say like Cal from The Gravity of Us, not like me really at all. Kind of maybe an aspirational version of me of like who I could have been if I had no shame. Like it's just like I love him so much. He's just so much not like me. Versus Marty is very much me on a page, or at least teenage me on a page. And so I tapped into a lot of those feelings. The characters, yes, there were some like there were a couple of characters inspired by my friends in the grad program that I went to, like the Maltese character. I had a friend from Malta who I met through this program, who was wonderful, and I wanted to like take some inspiration from my friendship with her. And so like kind of things like that, yes, but nothing derogatory or personal. Like there are some things that I went through a lot of experiences that Marty does, especially with like disordered eating and with anxiety. But the characters themselves that, you know, help cause that, I just want to say that that's not like we can name names for each of them. It's more like focus more on like Marty's journey and Marty's experience, because that's what I was kind of reflecting on.
Great, no, absolutely, brilliant. Phil, we need to sort of wrap up in a minute. We could literally talk all day. But let me just finish by asking you. You know, we talked about at the very beginning here just about the kind of, you know, the world of LGBTYA in general. Where do you see it being at the minute? How do you think it is compared to like a few years ago, and where do you think you're going? What's the state of the nation, in your opinion? Are you positive about what's happening in the minute? Are we making progress? Could we do more?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, you said it, like when we were in college, when we were younger, we didn't have anything. So like, it always blows my mind to see, you know, I have like a whole queer bookshelf up here. The fact that I can even say that, and like, I have not bought all the queer books. I just like, those are the ones that I happen to have on that shelf right there. But you can go into a bookstore and there's an entire, well, there are entire bookstores of queer books. So like, yeah, like, shout out to those bookstores, because like the fact that they can even exist now is amazing. Of course, there's more work that we have to do for you know, intersectionality and like making sure that everyone's voices are, you know, promoted in the same way. Because sometimes I do think, you know, diversity has been increasing and increasing in the books that are published, in YA specifically. There's been better representation there. However, you don't always get the great marketing backing for it, and that's a publishing problem. And so that's something that like I always kind of want to fight for internally and externally. Like as authors, I feel like we should always kind of push for that. But you know, I think we have made so much headway. It's wild. It's why, and every time I get asked this kind of question, you know, 6 months have passed and like 300,000 queer books have published, and I'm just like, how is this physically possible? I'm so like, and I mean that in like the best way. Like it's not, and also queer authors support each other so much, which is probably how it actually works so well, is because like we're all, you know, we're on in it together, and it's kind of cool that we're in like this world. So we're at a good place. Obviously, there are still many hurdles that need to be jumped. However, I feel honored that I'm even, you know, on the shelf with everyone else right now.
I'm nodding along to you, Phil, because I completely agree with that sentiment. I think it's absolutely right. A reminder that you can get all of Phil's fabulous books. Well, the first two anyway, the third one's not out till next year, so you can't get that one, but they're all available from
pre-order it.
The festival bookshop, and yeah, you can pre-order Golden Boys. Absolutely, you should do that. So thank you to everyone for watching. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Phil, for joining us today. I need to say a quick thank you to Wigtown Book Festival's funders, Event Scotland, Creative Scotland, and Dumfries and Galloway Council. Thank you for your support. It's fabulous. And just to mention as well, it's obviously been a bit of a challenging year, you know what I'm talking about, and the festival's had to do a bit of a reduced program this year, so there's lots of free online events which are fabulous, but they do still have to cover various costs. So if you are able to make a small donation, that would be hugely appreciated. You could go to the Wigtown Book Festival website if you'd like to make a small donation, just to help cover the cost of the festival and to secure its future as well. That would be a wonderful thing. But Phil, so nice to talk to you. This is one good thing to have come out of the pandemic, is that we can have these events we wouldn't normally have, you know, with authors from across the pond, and it can be a wonderful thing. It's been so nice talking to you. So
yes, thank you for the thoughtful questions, and thank you for guiding this conversation so wonderfully. I've been wanting to talk to you for so long. So
I know, and here we are at last, finally. No, me too. It's been fab. So thank you very much, and I'll see you around, Phil. But meanwhile, thanks for watching, everybody at home. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.